Hello, and welcome to my digital town hall conversation. Today we're talking about toxic substances and the work being done here at the State House to protect Vermonters and our communities and individuals with respect to water and other ways we're exposed to toxic chemicals. Joining me to discuss the issue today and work that's being done here in the building are Senators Brian Campion from Bennington County and serves on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, and also Lauren Hurl, the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. Before we start this conversation, it just so happens we have a related movie in my movie series coming up. We're going to show it twice this month. Once up in Coventry on February 11th at 6 o'clock. It's a movie called The Devil We Know. And it's about the toxic chemical PFOA and PFOS, the industry's knowledge about what it would do to workers and people that were exposed to the chemical, and yet that they continued to produce it, continue to have workers handle it, and really sort of the insidious nature of corporate interests versus community and public health. We're showing this on February 11th at 6 p.m. up in Coventry, where there's discussions around groundwater pollution and contamination from the landfill, questions with respect to that and expanding the landfill. So we thought it'd be appropriate to host the movie up there, as well as on February 28th here at the State House at 6 o'clock. So folks are welcome to go to either location, see the movie, and be a part of a discussion with a panel on these issues. So if you want more information about any of these, you can go to my website, ltgov.vermont.gov. That has these movies, other movies, and prior issues of this digital broadcast town hall. So I thought I'd start first with you, Senator. Thank you for being here. Obviously, Bennington County and parts of New York, I guess, were sort of ground zero for what we've now been going through for the last few years, groundwater contamination, actually directly relating to this chemical. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've seen in your community, your constituents' effects, and so forth.
Sure. First of all, I just want to thank the Lieutenant Governor for having me in and having this conversation and making people more aware of this serious issue. And certainly Lauren Hurl also has been a big proponent of really changing the equation as it relates to toxic chemicals. So thank you both. You and I were both in the Senate together the day that we all learned that PFOA was in the drinking water in the wells of just about 200-300 homes in Bennington. And I'll never forget it, learning that people had, as they shared with us during this process, moved to Vermont for the clean water. They've been, of course, showering it, raising their children in it. One woman, I remember during testimony, shared with us, you might recall this also because I know you've been in Bennington talking to people about this, filling her water bottles with what she believed was clean, fresh Vermont water before going on hikes. And then to learn that you've been drinking contaminated water is heartbreaking. And certainly, if you're raising children, in some ways I think it really hurts that much harder, that much worse. So the community, I have to say, has been absolutely incredible. Mm-hmm. They really have been patient.
Which I want to stress on that. I mean, being patient with the government process, with the legal process, with corporate interests in the ways that they are, when you're still in your home with water that you don't feel you can drink safely. To express that they were patient, which is absolutely true, is really a testament to those individuals, because I don't know that I would have been so patient.
Sure.
And also, you mentioned their water. Was this both private wells and some communal water?
Some communal water down in Pownell, but in Bennington and North Bennington, we were looking really at well water.
Individual wells,
And I think one of the reasons folks were so incredibly patient is the response of state government, which I believe was really remarkable. Gold standard. I mean, you look at people like our former Commissioner Alyssa Shuren, who was on the ground immediately during that time. The Shumlin administration, now the Scott administration, you yourself have been to Bennington several times to talk to people and not only work on these issues and support these issues, but just listen to people and let them know that their voices are being heard, and we're taking their voices and trying to put it into action to not only fix the situation that they've all been dealing with, but to make sure that we make changes so this doesn't happen again. And one of the things Lauren has been incredible on is working with us to expand these kinds of protections. I mean, we want to make sure this doesn't happen in drinking water, but there are other things we need to do to protect children, to protect families, those sorts of things. And again, Lauren has been a great advocate. You've been a great advocate, and so yeah, I appreciate being here and talking a little bit about the story. The other thing I should mention on the good side is, as people probably have heard, we do have a settlement with Saint-Gobain. So people are being hooked up to municipal water.
That's fairly recent.
Fairly recent, the final piece, that's right. So that's good, but as we also know, this is happening throughout the United States. So in a lot of ways, I do think Vermont would be a model for how to handle these kinds of crisis situations in other states, as well as some of the legislation that we're putting forward.
No, that's great. It's good to have an update, because sometimes I know when issues like this come up, they show up in the news for a day or two,
right?
And then something else shows up in the news for a day or two, whether it's what's going on in Washington or the most recent new crisis in Vermont, or sometimes even a good story. But this is, back to patience, a story and a reality for people that is continuing even when it's not in the news. And sometimes folks, we all are busy, folks are working hard, they've got their own family concerns, they start to forget. So one of the reasons we're having this conversation and still bring up this movie again is both how to keep people from forgetting, create, or at least have the issue be a part of the political conversation. And there was legislation last year relating to what happened here, but how do we also make sure in the future the right entity is held responsible for those costs? Because right now it's a combination of the state paying for a lot of these costs, which is taxpayers in Vermont, as well as this settlement that occurred. But there's no guarantee in the future of getting that settlement with the next one. And so there's some legislation that was introduced, it was passed last year, the governor vetoed it. I have heard a couple of concerns about how it may or may not have been too broad or impacted certain industries, and I'm trying to understand more about that, and sometimes at some point we'll talk with you about some of those things, see if there's ways to make sure the language does what we want it to do, but doesn't, as always, we don't want to create unforeseen consequences or unintended consequences. But Lauren, you can talk about a couple of the bills that VACV is been advocating for, working with legislators on. I know you've been a great leader on some of these, and explain what they do and why they're important.
And before you do, Lauren, if I just may add, I do appreciate you showing this movie, because I think people don't realize that things like PFOA, I mean, they're going to be with us forever. I mean, these are chemicals that are still being produced, and making people aware not only of the problem, but still what's out there is huge. So I hope people will go and see that.
I also just learned, because my spouse just told me, that she just watched this movie on Netflix. So it happens to be available on Netflix now as well. So if you can't get to one of the movie events, take a look, because it's an incredible expose on how some industries worked in the past, maybe some still do today, where sometimes the bottom line becomes more important than the community line and the community health. And I think we're in an awakening moment around this kind of topic here. Lead in drinking water in Michigan, communities all over the country. I'll tell you one statistic that I've heard in the movie that was just mind-boggling with the persistence of this chemical, was that basically they tested blood samples all around the world, and we all have this in our blood. The only blood sample they tested that did not show the existence of PFOA or PFOS was samples of blood that were taken from soldiers during World War II before this chemical was manufactured. But from people who are alive today in every corner of the world that they tested, we all have this in us. And it doesn't break down, it has a geological time half-life. And yet the genetic consequences that it can produce, if you see the movie, are really quite devastating, both in reproduction and in people who are exposed, the workers and so forth. So we did go down that in a little more detail, but please feel free to watch the movie on Netflix as well. It's pretty powerful. But there's work being done here in Montpelier to try to address some of those circumstances where we have good employers who do look at other bottom lines, but we also still have a financial pressure on the quarterly timeline of Wall Street that sometimes pushes people to make bad decisions. And
Yeah.
we don't think the state and taxpayers should be held accountable for those bad decisions. At least I don't. I believe you
No,
don't either.
very well.
And you're working on that. So why don't you
Yeah.
talk about those two bills?
Great. Yeah, and thanks for having me today. So, I mean, really coming out of the discovery of this PFAS contamination in Bennington, it really spurred a big conversation that the legislature set up this whole kind of panel that was scientists, business groups, administration folks, lawmakers, looking at, how did this happen? Why do we have toxic chemicals in Vermonters' drinking water? What's the scope of the problem? How do we prevent these chemicals from getting out there in the first place? And then if people have been exposed, how do we protect them and give them tools to try to make them as whole as possible? And so coming out of that whole process, there were two bills that were worked on really closely last year. And those bills, one was looking at toxic chemicals in children's products. And how do we reduce that avenue of exposure for our kids and say, if we have something like a PFAS chemical or formaldehyde or a whole list of chemicals, we don't want these things in our kids' products. What's the process that we can better let parents and others know which chemicals are being used in kids' products sold in Vermont, and how do we get them out of those products altogether? We shouldn't be using these chemicals in our kids' products. So that legislation to improve that program passed all the way through the legislature, went to the governor. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed that bill. We're back this year again, hoping that we can get that over the finish line and really make progress on that. Another important piece of legislation that was worked on last year quite extensively was looking at, to your point, of who pays for the harm of toxic contamination, and really looking at, there's this fundamental fairness. If you're someone who is living near a factory that is using this chemical, profiting off of using it, choosing to using it, the one with the information about the potential effects of it, and you just happen to live nearby, your property gets contaminated, your drinking water is harmed, and you're now dealing with the health impacts, your property is worth less now that you're a contaminated site, who bears that harm? And most of what we do in the State House is trying to protect victims, and in this case we're saying, no, industry, you should be let off the hook.
Right.
It should be taxpayers or that individual that should bear the harm. And so we're saying with legislation that Senator Campion and Senator Sears in particular have championed, let's make the polluters pay. The person who chose to use that chemical is the one who should pay those costs. And
not the taxpayers, not the person
taxpayers,
harmed,
not the
right.
victim of
Right.
the contamination, but and to get to your point of the calculus that businesses make, if you know that you might be responsible down the road when you're deciding, do I use a toxic chemical or do I look for a safer chemical? We want to be pushing businesses to be making the right choices there, knowing that I'm going to think about the whole lifetime of this chemical, not just the minute I use it, profit off of it, and then dump it for somebody else to worry about.
That's a really good point, if I may.
Yeah.
I thought Lauren said it really well. That legislation, and as you probably heard, a lot of businesses were fearful, but we really believed that it would make people think twice. It would really push for better decisions, because I think we all agree in Vermont, we don't want business at any cost. We don't want, as you said in your introduction, people to come to the state and in any way leave what was left behind that it needs to be cleaned up. There is a greater good that we ought to be thinking about.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize, one of the things that, these companies are producing something that they also think people want. So when you look at PFOA and PFOS, some folks out there may not know what the connection is to, well, what's that mean to me? Why does it matter? Well, it was one of the main chemical ingredients in Teflon. And so, at the time, a nonstick pan was sort of, mamma mia, less cleaning, it made cooking easier, it was a great benefit at that time. Primarily women were in the kitchen, and folks were like, wow, make work a little easier here. And so it was a eureka moment for a lot of folks. And then since then, it actually became, it's a water repellent as well as, a grease repellent and everything else that sticks to a pan. So put it in Gore-Tex. People don't realize that this isn't just about Teflon pans. It's about a lot of the water repellent outerwear that we use, and in Vermont, a lot of us use that. So I think a lot of people would say, wow, I like those things. Those have been helpful to me. It's made my life easier. It's made it more fun to be outside skiing or snowshoeing or recreating or whatnot, snowmobiling. And, we as consumers trust, we think, well, federal government and state government, we have the EPA, we have these environmental regulatory bodies that are looking out for us. And so we trust that a product that's on the shelf is safe for us. The reason this movie is called The Devil We Know is because it was proven later in documents that the chemical company knew that this was harmful. And that, I think, is an important piece to holding polluters accountable in this, thinking twice about it. It's one thing if you don't really know. It's a whole nother if you know and you choose not to reveal that information to the regulatory agencies, who then are giving it the seal of approval, which makes people think, oh, it's okay. So it isn't just sort of, you get punished because you made a mistake. I mean, maybe it partly is in this case. I don't know the exact wording of the law, and maybe you can help me out with this, but particularly when they do all the research, because we've tried to pass laws in the past that said families of chemicals, can be reviewed and okayed or not okayed, and rather than just having to test each single one, because we don't have the tax dollars, because folks are appropriately sort of tight with their money. They want us to be fiscally responsible as policymakers to test every single chemical, which means we as the public rely on the research that the private entities do.
And you bring up an excellent point. We are trying right now, at least looking at natural resources, can we look at all the PFASs almost at once?
As a family of chemicals.
Right, there are 4,000.
Right.
And so is there a way similar to what people did back with PCBs? They said, okay, we're going to address them kind of all at once rather than, your good point,
You change one hydrogen molecule out on the
Right.
end of the line of the chemical.
And just, to your point, the PFAS contamination kind of raised this whole issue, and just to be clear, it kind of highlighted to all of us and to policymakers, our regulatory system at the federal level is broken, and it has been acknowledged for decades. There was a law passed in the 70s, and it's essentially, they've only banned 5 chemicals in the entire history of that law, and there's more than, about 90,000 registered chemicals out there. And so, it's basically this premise of chemicals are innocent until proven guilty. So unlike pharmaceuticals that you test before you put them out in the market for industrial chemicals, you can put them out, and it's only once you can essentially prove that there's a problem that you can start any kind of regulatory process to,
That's one of the things
to get them
Lauren
on the
taught
shelf.
all of us in committee is, just that. I mean, toothpaste has to go through all these processes in order to be on the shelf, but so many things, it's really, we'll put it out there and see what happens and wait till there's a problem.
Indeed. And then, this issue is broadening. We talked about lead in the Detroit drinking water earlier in reference. There's different issues all over the country, and now we're finding there's lead in some of our Vermont schools as well. And I kudos to the governor for sort of indicating, let's try to get this done quickly. I know it's going to be the financing of it and how do we make sure this happens right. Sometimes the devil is in the details,
Right.
of course. So what can we know or talk about that? If either of you have more knowledge on that, maybe you can share.
Yeah, so a number of us sponsored a bill after hearing from constituents this summer, and also seeing the governor's report back where they tested 16 schools, I think it was 16 schools basically, and found lead levels in a number of them to be high. So what Senate Education acted quite swiftly, actually. They passed our bill out, I believe it was last Friday, and they came to an agreement that they're going to test schools within a 1-year period, and they're considering a safe level of lead to be 3 parts per billion. The bill actually said 1 part per billion, and we've heard from the American Academy of Pediatrics and others, as you as a father, you as a mother, and society in general would know, lead in water there's no good level of lead in water. But the administration was really, they came in hard and pushed for it to be 15 parts per billion, and I want to applaud every member of the education committee that said that was unacceptable, and they all came to an agreement that it would be 3 parts per billion that they would test. And I also am grateful, as you pointed out, initially the administration said, let's try to do this over a 4-year period, but everybody said, no, you can't have a child in elementary school. It's almost your entire elementary school career to be drinking, lead.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I think I might have misspoke, so appreciate
No,
it.
so anyhow, it's again, I really appreciate all of my colleagues that are on that committee. It's Democrats and Republicans, and everybody came together.
Mhm.
So.
Which happens more than some people think,
Right,
actually, which is a whole other topic for another day about how democracy
Right.
works, and in particular the Senate.
But here the
also
science
House.
was put in front of them, and they made the right decision.
They did, yeah. And can you give an update? Where is that bill now?
So it's now moved to the Appropriations Committee, so as you mentioned, it's now figuring out, we wanna make sure that we have the funding in place so that we're not slowed down in figuring out, and that there's, for equity issues, that every school has access to funding to do this, so it's not just wealthier school districts that get this quicker, but that we get it to every single school in the state, and also childcare facilities.
And that's just testing the water.
That's correct.
That's not even necessarily
It
yet
does require
how do you fund,
remediation, but yeah, paying
Okay.
for that.
paying for that. And we get into conversations, we'll maybe just touch on it briefly before we actually wrap up, that we want to do things, but we don't want too high taxes in the state, and it is hard. We don't have a major urban area to basically fund our state the way most other, even rural states have. They still have a big city and a big suburban area. We don't have that. And so a lot of people are struggling. And so then you go, well, how do we potentially pay what may be millions of dollars, depending on how many schools have contaminated water, how many wells need to be drilled, how far away does the water be transported from? And I just put that out there as a topic because sometimes we hear in the political rhetoric, we can't afford this and we can't afford that, and that's fair. We recently, I put it out in my newsletter, which you can get by signing up on our website as well, a report that said Vermont's overall expenses, on average compared to nationwide, are about 1.6% higher than the national average. So when we talk about affordability, yes, we are a little bit more expensive. We also have winter, we have to replace our roads more than southern states. We don't have a big city. But what I found remarkable in that report is that our average income is only 82% of the national average. So when we have this conversation of affordability, and I'm going to be talking about this just about every opportunity I can, I think it's important to look at the expense side of everyone's equation and their income. And if you hear 1.6 over and 82% under,
Right.
18% under, it seems to me the bigger problem is about income.
Yeah.
We should always be looking at expenses, but if we say, well, we just can't spend any more money, would we not spend money on cleaning up lead in drinking water?
Right.
What is it that people don't want the legislative body and government spending its money on?
If we were to pass a PFAS bill that addresses PFAS as, we did PCBs, what could we be protecting people from in the future?
As an
Health
expense down
costs,
the line.
Exactly.
Huge.
I mean,
Yeah.
look at the expense costs just hooking people, residents in Bennington, up to clean water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And lead, there's lots of studies looking at, it's linked to ADHD, it's linked to lost IQ points, and it's millions of dollars that the state pays, tens of millions,
That's
for
right.
lead contamination. So we're paying for it one way or another, and the prevention's cheaper than, as in so many cases,
Right.
and just the harm that's causing
And
families.
was PFAS and PFOA a little bit of a canary in the coal mine of how many more chemicals are out there?
Right.
That are going to lead to these tens and $20 and $50 million expenses that are just astronomical for a state of 600,000 people. And so just want to put it out there that sometimes thinking ahead, doing a little bit of preventative medicine, for lack of a better term, from the one lesson we had, is probably a good idea. So if you care about these issues, I would certainly urge you, as I always do, to engage in the process, call your representatives and senators. I always ask people, first ask your representative what they know or don't know about it. Before one jumps down your political representative's proverbial throat, they're everyday citizens from your community. They may or may not know all the kinds of details that now you may know from watching this movie, watching this film, doing some research. You can be a resource librarian for your legislator. Ask them where they are, offer them more information, and maybe suggest how they could help make some of these ideas move forward. If you happen to agree. If you don't agree, voice your opinion as well. But the process here is made better by your input. You can also contact VACV, Vermont Alliance of Conservation Voters. They're always looking for folks to be involved in many of these issues. And so, in closing, I certainly want to thank you both for participating in this
Thanks very much.
conversation.
Appreciate it.
Remember, we have all the digital town halls on the website, ltgov.vermont.gov. You can sign up for the newsletter that includes those kinds of affordability statistics and others and other issues. by going to that same website. And you can visit the Facebook page at VTLT.gov. I'm trying to figure out DZ and VTLT and have a little rap going here. And you can also chime in on that Facebook page if you have ideas you want to hear from us and other legislators and advocates about or perspectives for future digital town halls. I'd be happy to hear from you. So thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.